and welcome to episode 44 of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. I'm your host, Josh Hennig. On this edition of the podcast, some aftermath reaction to Kevin Durant injury in Game 5 of the NBA Finals, plus some perspective on the latest news about the upcoming Batman Trilogy that is going to be a part of the DC Entertainment Universe, and thoughts on the past weekend's UFC 238 card and what it means for the UFC moving forward. So let's open up a cold one and get started on episode 44 of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. Topic number one here on the Mutant Blitz Podcast. I wanted to give some perspective on the Kevin Durant injuring himself in his return to the NBA Finals. It was tough to watch, and everyone has an opinion about what happened on Monday night. Should he have played? Shouldn't he have played? Whose fault it was? And I want to spend less time focusing on whose fault it was and why it happened, but what it means moving forward for Kevin Durant in the NBA. I think the first most important thing that I walk away from this is the fact that Kevin Durant, maybe he really is misunderstood. Maybe there is a part of Kevin Durant that we don't fully embrace and understand. And when the Warriors general manager, Bob Myers, gets up and says the following, it really stands out to me in a way that I don't think a lot of people could appreciate and understand until on late Monday night on the East Coast. Bob Myers, a very emotional general manager of the Warriors, says this about Kevin Durant.
He's one of the most misunderstood people. He's a good teammate. He's a good person. It's not fair. I'm lucky to know him.
For a grown adult to have that kind of reaction about somebody, anybody, on one hand feels a little weird for anybody to have that kind of reaction about a basketball player getting injured. But I think that reaction was much more about understanding that there's a reality that has evolved from the perception of Kevin Durant by certain people in the media, by certain people in the NBA fan base, by people who dislike Kevin Durant's decision to leave the Thunder and go to the Warriors a few years ago, to people's dislike of how he's handled himself online, in the media, how some of his comments have been betrayed. And then on top of all that, in the midst of him recovering from his original injury, which was a calf strain about a month ago, there were reports out in the media, whether they were truly could be substantiated or they were just hearsay, but there were reports there were people in the Warriors organization, obviously not the GM Bob Myers, but people in the Warriors organization that felt that Kevin Durant, maybe he could have been able to go, and that maybe he was being too careful. The Warriors were being too careful with him, or maybe Kevin Durant didn't really want to be out there with his teammates. Hear what Charles Barkley had to say on ESPN's Get Up about his perception of Kevin Durant, how it was unfair to have him play. And I'm not putting these two audio cuts together for you to compare them, but for you to understand that they're two very different perspectives of the same person and situation.
I don't think you can ever leave it up to a player because players always want to play. But I think if you ask any rational player, Damon, Jalen Rose, Jay Williams, to put a guy who hadn't played basketball in over a month into Game 5 of the finals and had some type of move around the day before, I don't think that's fair to that man. And you saw the results. It's just not fair. It's Game 5 of the World Championship. He hasn't played real basketball in a month. That's unfair to put him in that situation. And the proof is in the pudding, plain and simple.
What you hear there is two totally different perspectives. Neither one of those perspectives are invalid or inaccurate or anything like that. The problem is that Kevin Durant, in many ways, has become one of the most polarizing figures in all of sports. And your like or dislike or your fandom or your whatever it may be, your personal perspective of Kevin Durant as a player or a person, I think has to change somewhat after what happened Monday night. Because when you look at Kevin Durant, you realize that this is a guy who was so competitive and felt such a sense of loyalty and a sense of I need to help my team down 3-1, that overcame any better sensibility that he may have had about his short-term and long-term future, not just as a basketball player, but as a professional trying to earn a certain level of income for as long as he can. Don't overlook the fact that, yeah, medicine is way far advanced today than it was 10, 20, 30 years ago. But tearing an Achilles tendon is still a very serious injury and is going to take him at least 200, 300 days to fully recover from that. And even then, who knows exactly what he's going to be at that point. So for him to go out there thinking he was okay, the Warriors playing him the number of minutes they did, he played 12 of the first 14 minutes of that game on Monday night. There's something to be said for the fact that Kevin Durant went in there not caring about what happened to him. And then when it did happen to him, it's almost like there was a feeling of, well, we knew this was going to happen, which is totally unfair because any athlete can be injured anytime, anywhere, any place, doing anything. You could be injured crossing the street. You could be injured driving your car. You can be injured in a contact or non-contact injury. Injuries are a part of sports. And this attitude that Kevin Durant shouldn't have played Monday night is just as insane as the attitude that Kevin Durant didn't want to be on the floor with his teammates, or the same belief that his Warrior teammates were happy to be playing the NBA Finals without him. All of this is bunk. Because Kevin Durant showed us Monday night that he's not the villain that people have made him out to be. That he is not the jerk or the self-absorbed person that people have made him out to be. Look, maybe he's not a refined individual when it comes to his public persona or his public presentation of himself. Yes, maybe he is not as clean-cut. Maybe he's not as altogether as he should be as a human being. Fine, whatever. You know what? I kind of don't care at this point. What I saw on Monday night was an athlete who wanted to play basketball, an athlete who wanted to be out there on the court and wanted to compete and wanted to help his team, who were down 3-1 in the NBA Finals, win a basketball game. And that want by him, that desire to be out there, that feeling that he gave everyone, even if it was only for X number of minutes on Monday night, showed me that this guy is somebody who wants to be successful as a basketball player. That he wants to play basketball. He loves the game of basketball. And for his teammates to react the way they did, for the GM to react the way he did, it's not about if he should or shouldn't have been out there. To me, it's all about the fact that Kevin Durant is not just another guy trying to collect a paycheck. If you've listened to me on the radio, I've said this for years. There are two kinds of athletes. There are athletes who love the game, and there are athletes who love what the game does for their bank account. And Kevin Durant showed me, didn't tell me, he showed me that he cares about playing the game of basketball. Now, you may not like his decision to join the Warriors. You may not like how he handles himself on Twitter. You may not like the fact that he has taken such a excessive interest in his business interest outside the basketball world. You may not like how he handles himself in the media, but doggone it, you cannot disrespect the man's want and desire to play the game of basketball and his sense of loyalty to his teammates. And after last night, I wouldn't be surprised if he doesn't opt into his contract and stay with the Warriors going into next season, despite the fact that most people assumed he was going to hit free agency. And the biggest reason why I think he's going to opt into that contract has to do with the fact that Kevin Durant doesn't come back to play with those teammates if he was already 1 foot out the door. Now, I'm not guaranteeing you that he is going to be a Golden State Warrior next season. What I'm telling you is that you cannot underestimate what we saw Monday night, which is a basketball player who has a connection with his team, who has a connection with an organization, who has a connection with people that goes above and beyond dollars and cents. I think Kevin Durant's future as a basketball player has been impacted by that injury because he may not play at all next season. And even if he misses all of next season, who knows when he is actually going to return? And how good is he going to be on day one? And whether it's the Warriors or the next team he plays for, protect him from hurting himself again. And I think part of that comes down to the fact, let's be realistic, the Golden State Warriors mismanaged him on Monday night. If you want to blame them for anything, realistically, you should blame Steve Kerr for not being a little bit more sensitive to the situation, which was you played him too many minutes Monday night. Now, does that influence his decision to stay or go? I have no idea. For all I know, Kevin Durant's decision to stay with the Warriors or leave in free agency may realistically have nothing to do with what happened on Monday night at all, and may have more to do with the fact that Kevin Durant moved most of his business interests to the state of New York, and maybe, like LeBron, he thinks that he needs to be closer to his off-the-court business interests than spending all of his focus on just on-the-court activities. And if he does decide to do that, I'm not going to judge him. I'm not going to tell him that's the wrong decision to make. But what I will say is, for Kevin Durant to leave the Warriors at this time would surprise me. As the NBA Finals come to a close, do not forget that Kevin Durant chose to be on the court with his teammates, whether he felt pressured, whether he felt pushed into it, whether the Warriors training staff forced him to come back sooner, whether he forced them to clear him. Whatever the situation that led to this moment is, know that Kevin Durant is cared about by his teammates, by his general manager, and by an organization that may lose him after this year. Do not be surprised if that sense of loyalty creeps up when the season ends and he may decide to stay in Golden State just a little bit longer. Sometimes one's loyalty to their friends and coworkers can have more of an impact on what one decides to do with their life, professionally and personally, than just the money and the economic opportunities that may come from another situation presenting itself. And I have to wonder, does Kevin Durant say, I can't worry about free agency right now. I need to focus on having a complete and total rehab from this injury that I sustained. That may be more important to him than the New York Knicks, the Brooklyn Nets, or the Los Angeles Clippers calling him when 6 p.m. Eastern on June 30th hits. Topic number 2 on this edition of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. I wanted to address the news that came out from the DC Entertainment universe about the future of not just Batman, but also what it means for what their plans are long-term movie-wise. So the news came out recently that Robert Pattinson, who came to fame in the Twilight series, will be playing the role of Bruce Wayne and Batman in an upcoming Batman Trilogy directed by Matt Reeves. And there has been a lot of controversy about not just Pattinson getting this role, but also the fact of what direction is DC going in. And I wanted to just give you a quick rundown of my perspective on this, why I don't think this is as big a deal as everyone making it out to be, and why this should have been expected all along from those over at DC Entertainment. The first point I want to address is the casting of Robert Pattinson. Now, I know a lot of people have the opinion that Pattinson may not look in the traditional sense of a Bruce Wayne or a Batman. He doesn't have the traditional look of what people tend to aesthetically think of when they think of Batman. But I think this is an unfair thing to do to the actor because, one, many of the people who have played the role of Batman over the years, I don't think many of them would have placed that character in that role before they fulfilled the role. It's not like there was a great applause or huge amount of people who loved the idea of Christian Bale being cast for his role in the Dark Knight trilogy, but yet he did an excellent job with it. I think most people were unsure what Val Kilmer and George Clooney were going to be like when they were cast for their Batman roles. Or if you want to spin it even to more current, what Ben Affleck's character was going to be like in the Batman role. A lot of the assumptions about Batman over the years have been unfair to those actors, whether it is in a positive or a negative sense. And I think that it's unfair to judge Pattinson before he ever gets to play the role. The second point I want to make is that most actors who have played superhero or comic book roles in the last 15 years have gone through major physical transformations. For example, look at the physical transformation that Hugh Jackman has gone through from the very first day he played Wolverine to the most recent Logan movie. He's gone through massive physical transformations, and you look at his physiology when it came to the Wolverine movie, X-Men Days of Future Past, he looks like a different human being almost. You look at the physical transformation that Henry Cavill went through to become the Man of Steel, or you look at the other physical transformations that different actors and actresses have gone through over the last 15 years. We know more about health and fitness and building of muscle and physiology than we ever knew before. So putting on 10, 15, 20 pounds of muscle may not be as difficult as a task to be asked of an actor that it was previously. Also, keep in mind that if you look around, whether it's TV shows or movies, many of the actors and actresses who are playing roles now are already in decent shape. So asking Pattinson to hit the gym for a few months, maybe a little harder than he usually does, is not going to be the most ridiculous thing in the world. Look at the physical transformation that Stephen Amell has gone through over the last several years. When he first started as the Arrow, I don't think many people really thought of him as a physical specimen, whereas now he's infamous or famous, depending on who you ask, for his workout regimens. You look at the physical transformation that many of these people go through, I don't think it's that far-fetched for Pattinson to put himself into that physical frame that is needed to play this role. The third point I want to make is about the new Batman movie trilogy that is unfair is you have to understand what DC is doing. As you've heard me tell you on the podcast here last year, DC has a beautiful opportunity in front of them to reset their universe. And I think that the expectation is that everything that you saw before Aquaman is in some way or another going to be vanquished or going to be reset or erased or rewritten. And the reason I say that is because you look at the direction they're going with their movies. Aquaman, Shazam, Birds of Prey, Wonder Woman 1984, and now the Batman Trilogy. They're trying to change the way they are going about telling their stories, giving their characters to the audiences. They're trying to get away from the darker elements and the more nefarious aspects of their movie telling and trying to create a movie universe that is less in competition with Marvel and more planting their own flag and differentiating themselves from Marvel. And the Batman trilogy has a great opportunity to do that. If you look at what Matt Reeves has told people, Reeves says that he wants to take a different view on the Batman character. in that he says he wants Batman in more of a detective role, that he wants to explore the idea of Batman tracking down criminals and solving crimes and allowing the character to have a growing arc as a transformation from the early years of Bruce Wayne moving forward. And there's a lot of comic book material to draw off of when it comes to that aspect. Whereas we saw the TV show Gotham get very dark and very unnecessarily deviant from the original Batman mythology, I think that a character that focuses more on Batman the detective and less on Batman the superhero or the Batman the vigilante actually has a very good opportunity to tell a very different Batman story than we've seen. We've never really gotten to see that in the last 30 years. Michael Keaton's character was always more of a advanced Batman. We didn't get a lot of history with that character. And when we saw Val Kilmer and George Clooney take the roles, they were kind of just trying to keep the story going or keep capitalizing on the Batman character that Keaton had set the groundwork for with his first two movies. When we saw The Dark Knight, it's supposed to be kind of a reboot, a reset, a totally different telling of the Batman universe through the eyes of Christopher Nolan and David Goyer. When we saw Ben Affleck come along as Batman in the movies, that was supposed to be a telling of the character as an older Batman, a more seasoned Batman, a more experienced, been through, the ups and downs already type of Batman. Now we have the opportunity to tell Batman in a totally different way, in a way that is very much of a throwback to the comic book world of Batman the Detective. DC does stand for Detective Comics. So I don't think this is all a bad thing. I think that we've seen actors transform their bodies. The fact that we know that DC is trying to go a totally different direction than they've gone previously. The fact that they're trying to tell Batman in a different way. And DC is not trying to do what Marvel is doing. I think that's all a positive thing. I'm not going to make any grandiose judgments until I know more. From what I've seen so far, I think there's a lot of overreaction about what Batman is and who he's going to be with this new The Batman Trilogy. I think that the idea of what they're doing is actually more positive than it is negative. To actually do something different, I think to some people may be unfamiliar, and that in and of itself is scary, but the way they're going about things, I think, is much more in tune with what the comic books are supposed to be than what they're not. I think a lot of people get caught up in, well, does he look like said character? Well, a lot of actors can, grow into a character or grow into a role. You look at the X-Men Fox universe ending in 2019, and now Marvel will get all their characters back under their umbrella and full creative control after the X-Men Dark Phoenix movie. But a lot of people have grown to love and enjoy and appreciate what the multiple actors and actresses have done with the X-Men universe over the last 19 years. It doesn't make that those characters bad or wrong or anything like that, but let's be realistic. A lot of those characters were revised for the Fox universe. They were changed or morphed or muted or overpowered or depowered to fit into this Fox universe. It doesn't mean that all those movies were bad. Yes, some of them were absolutely horrible, like X-Men Last Stand and Wolverine Origins just totally fell flat on its face. And I think there's a lot of people who didn't like the direction of X-Men Apocalypse and how they handled such a grandiose villain such as Apocalypse. But at the end of the day, a lot of those characters, a lot of those movies did very well because of the fact that those characters worked very hard at embracing those versions of those heroes and villains, and the audiences came to appreciate the work that was put into this telling of this story. I think the frustrating thing for DC is that they haven't been more transparent about what their real plans are when it comes to these movies. I think that's really what the bigger problem is. Marvel has been very forward about what they're doing, about the fact that now there's a multiverse and that Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. is not in the same timeline as Avengers, and that all these different characters they've introduced on movies and television have certain different places and roles in the bigger Marvel multiverse. Marvel's been very straightforward and very upfront about what their short and long-term plans are for their entertainment. And I think that that's something that DC has not explained. And the fact that DC has not had everything connected and it's been a little bit more disjointed and disconnected, I think that's part of what frustrates people. It's not that they actually dislike what they're going to do with the Batman trilogy or that people dislike Pattinson getting the role. Is that people want to know, how does this work together? Why are you building this universe and it's so loosely disconnected? I think part of the problem is that, there was an opinion that the Flash, Ezra Miller's character, was supposed to explain a lot of this. When they said there was going to be a Flash movie, the whole point of him having this Flash movie was supposed to be that you were supposed to have a Flashpoint storyline, that you were supposed to have a explanation of why things have changed and why we're going in a different direction. And they were supposed to have used the Flash to reset the universe, similar like they did in comics. And the fact that they didn't do that, I think for some people was a little frustrating. And I think that they were a little disappointed in the fact that we're not getting a Flashpoint movie before we got this change in the Batman, because it's too closely connected when it comes to all these characters to the Justice League movie. You still have all these other actors and actresses still playing the roles of these huge characters, and there's no explanation for why is Batman younger? Why is Batman even connected to the rest of the universe? How can you have a Justice League without Batman? And I get all that. I'm not saying any of it is wrong or bad. What I'm saying is that I think that there is a misunderstanding about what DC is really doing long term. I think because there is that confusion and that misunderstanding and that all these questions that are coming along with this, I think that that's where it would just help the general audience to understand what is going on better. And I think that if maybe DC and Warner Brothers was a little bit more upfront with the audience about what their short and long-term plans are for this universe, the reception to the news about the Batman trilogy, about this different take on Batman, about a very different style of actor coming into the universe, I think would be a little bit more accepted, and audiences and fans will be less reactionary about it. Because at the end of the day, I think that there's an attitude that Batman is supposed to look and act and be a certain way. And I think a lot of those opinions are not based on the comic book Batman. A lot of those opinions are based on who is your favorite Batman. If you're someone who loves the Michael Keaton Batman, you judge every Batman based on that. If Christian Bale is your favorite Batman, you compare every Batman based on that. I think part of the problem is that people have let the movies influence their opinion of who and what Batman should be instead of the source material, which is the comics, which is part of the reason why Gotham was such a far diversion from the original Batman mythology. It was a retelling of it. It was a revisionist history of it. It was trying to create a universe without Batman, but setting the groundwork for Batman to come along. And at the end of the day, the show had to end. The show really had lost its way. It wasn't even a Batman origin story anymore. It was more about Jim Gordon and the other characters, and Bruce Wayne just happened to be there at times. I think a lot of people, they've really lost track of who Batman is and what Batman is supposed to be. And if Matt Reeves is serious about having a Batman that is supposed to be from a different point of view, that's supposed to be something that is more about Batman the detective, more about something that is based on the history of the comics, something about Batman, his development from the early years and his evolution and his transformation into the superhero that we have now seen in the other movies. I think that could be very exciting, and it done right could be great. But that's why I am not making any assumptions. I am not dissing this. I think there could be a lot of positives taken from this, and I'm going to take a wait and see, because at the end of the day, I'm not really sure what DC and Warner Brothers are doing, and I'm not going to sit here and make a grandiose judgment on limited information. Topic number 3 on episode 44 of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. UFC 238 is in the book, arguably the biggest UFC fight card of 2019 to date. Yeah, there are bigger headliners down the road. Jon Jones fighting in July. Khabib Nurmagomedov projected the fight early September. But this card was the most stacked of all the cards and arguably is going to have the most ramifications moving forward. And what I wanted to touch on specifically on this is not I want to go fight by fight, decision by decision, but I want to focus on a handful of specific fights on this card and how it's going to affect the future of the UFC. The impressive performance by Henry Cejudo to now become a 2-weight title holder. He is now the bantamweight champion. He defeated Marlon Moraes on Saturday night, and he is now the flyweight and bantamweight champion. And this is a big deal, not just because it's historical. Yeah, he's one of only a handful of men to ever do this. Not just win a belt in multiple weight classes, but can currently hold 2 belts at the same time. But the other big deal about Cejudo winning is the UFC has been in flux, and there has not been a lot of, for lack of a better term, agreement of what to do with the UFC flyweight division. Demetrius Johnson was in some ways keeping the flyweight division alive, and Cejudo had argued that, look, I want to keep the flyweight division. I want to be the champion of the division. And now all of a sudden he wins the bantamweight title on Saturday night, and all of a sudden he's done with the flyweight division. He doesn't care about it anymore. He wants to move up a weight and fight 145 pounds. He wants to fight the big names at 135. And this is a situation where I think it's hard for the UFC to do the right thing because there really is no right answer. Cejudo is a guy who, he won the bantamweight belt, and as the bantamweight champion, he has a long line of people who he needs to fight, least of which is a guy in Aljamain Sterling who also won on Saturday night, a guy in Sterling who you could argue should be the number 1 contender. He's on a 4-fight winning streak, and his only loss over the last few years has been to the guy that Cejudo just beat, Marlon Moraes. And since Aljamain lost to Moraes, he has won 4 straight fights. And before Moraes, he was already on a 2-fight winning streak as well, beating one of the biggest names in the division, Hennig, the former champ himself. So Aljamain Sterling has proved that he deserves to fight for the bantamweight belt. But you have Cejudo who's telling the UFC, I want to be paid like a heavyweight. I want to go out there and fight the biggest names. And what does he do? He goes out and names everybody not Aljamain Sterling. He names Dominic Cruz. He names Uriah Faber. And realistically, that is a slap into the face of the entire division because Dominic Cruz is still coming off an injury. You have other guys like Cody Garbrandt, who's a former champ in the division. Aljamain Sterling should be the number 1 contender after Saturday night. And don't forget about the guy that Aljamain Sterling beat a couple fights ago, Jimmy Rivera. Well, Peter Yan just beat Rivera as well, and Yan himself is on a pretty lengthy winning streak, predating the UFC. Yan has won 8 straight fights, and some of them have been against some pretty impressive opposition, including John Dodson, a former perennial number 1 contender in the UFC. So you're talking about different people who are available at bantamweight for Cejudo to fight. And he's already thinking about not just forgetting about the flyweight division, but talking about moving up to 145. He said on Monday that if Frankie Edgar beats Max Holloway, that he wants to move up and fight Edgar. I don't like the bravado. I don't like the ego. Look, celebrate your victory. I understand there's a lot of adrenaline in the moment, but someone's got to pull Cejudo aside, whether it's someone in his camp or someone in the UFC, and sit him down and be like, yo, man, you got 2 belts. You have 2 divisions that you are now responsible of representing. Stop talking about super fights, get your head in the game, and defend your belt. Prove that you are a triple C, as he calls himself, a 3 champ. When's Cejudo going to have multiple defenses on his resume? You know what makes Jon Jones great? that he has defended his belt multiple times. Stipe Miocic, what made him a great champion? He defended his belt multiple times till Daniel Cormier beat him. Cormier defended the UFC light heavyweight belt multiple times, and he's defended the heavyweight belt before. That's what makes a great champion. I'm sorry, but Henry Cejudo should not be considered one of the best fighters on the planet until he actually defends his belt multiple times. If I'm the UFC, I turn to him and say, look, you want to be the 145-pound super fight and be a three division champion? You either need to move back down the flyweight and defend your belt one more time there, or you need to defend your belt in the bantamweight division this calendar year. One of those two. You got to make a decision. You got to earn your keep. You got to earn that gold that you put over your shoulder. Conor McGregor put a horrible precedent out there. He made it look like that it's okay to just win a belt and move on to the next division. And I understood that Conor McGregor, it was a very, very, very hard weight cut for him, cutting down the 145. But he did it, and he put on a long win streak, and he was successful. Look, he's a dynamic personality. He's become a bit of a fan favorite. But the dude has only won 5 straight fights. It's not like he's been on this dominant fighter. There's a guy right now at 125 who has beaten him. Yeah, it was a split decision. And people say it was controversial because Cejudo was deducted a point for a low blow. But Joseph Benavidez has perennially been one of the top fighters in not just the UFC, but at 135 and 125. Cejudo owes it to MMA fans. He owes it to the fight game. He owes it to his legacy to forget about these super fights, stop being such a bloated ego, cut the weight. You want to be a Triple C champ? Prove it. Go back down to 125, fight Joseph Benavidez, avenge that loss on your resume. Then you can talk about the super fights. Then you can talk about Dominic Cruz. Then you can call yourself a real Triple C, because then you show that you're not just out for the money, but you're also out for the legacy and to embody what it means to be a mixed martial artist. I understand you want to get paid. Everybody wants to get paid. You're no different than anybody else. You know, guys like Cejudo, they're so worried about how much they're going to get paid, yet they act like every other champion is out there banking huge money. What? Does he think that when Demetrius Johnson was defending the belt 10 times over that he was making big money? Or that when Dominic Cruz was champion or Cody Garbrandt was champion, he was making money 10 times over? Pretty much not. Because at the end of the day, you have to prove that you're worth that big payday. And until Cejudo shows, in my opinion, that he can go down the flyweight and avenge the last loss that he has not avenged on his resume, Joseph Benavidez, that's what I would do. Now, I get it. Benavidez right now is expected to have a rematch against Formiga coming up later this month. But to me, that doesn't matter. I don't care that he has a rematch. I would tell the UFC this: as long as Benavidez wins that fight, I'm going to go and fight him. And you know what? If Formiga does beat him in that rematch, then I'll fight him, because that was a split decision win as well. Cejudo needs to prove that he is the real king of the flyweight division before he is ever owed any more fights. Now, the other 2 fights I want to focus on from UFC 238. Let's start with the Donald Cerrone, Tony Ferguson fight. Doctor stoppage, TKO. Cerrone, he should have never blown his nose. His eye blew up. It was all his fault. I am 100% on board how frustrated people are. I know it's a very frustrating situation. I don't know what the UFC is going to do. I think they could go one of 2 ways. I think Ferguson has proven time and time again that he deserves a shot at the UFC belt. And as long as the Khabib versus Poirier fight happens later this year, I think Ferguson should get the winner of that fight, because that's going to unify the UFC lightweight belt. Now, Tony's a guy who I think he's not like a lot of other fighters. He's not crying about respect. He's not out there crying how, what he should or shouldn't deserve. He's not like some of these other fighters in today's game. He just fights whoever's put in front of him. And I think that for Tony, he's got to make a decision. Does he really want to sit around and wait for Khabib and Dustin the fight later this year, and whoever wins that fight may not be ready to fight before the end of the year. That fight might have to wait till, he might be waiting around till January, February, or March to even get a shot at the belt, because the turnaround might not be that quick. Does Ferguson go to the UFC and say, look, I want to run it back with Cerrone? Does he turn to the UFC and say, hey, can you set me up with somebody else in the meantime? And then some people may say, well, it's kind of risky. Hey, he has every right to do what he wants. I don't think that Ferguson should have to sit around and wait if he doesn't want to. It's just, he's in a really difficult situation. As for Donald Cerrone, I think that he and his camp need to have a conversation about what he wants to do moving forward, because this was 34 days from his last fight, and he took some serious punishment in that second round from Tony Ferguson. You could argue that he might have won that first round, maybe barely, but Ferguson dominated him in that second round. And not that Cerrone couldn't have come back and won the fight, but you kind of have to wonder, where does Cerrone go from here? Because Cerrone has said multiple times that he wants to take a shot at the title. He doesn't want to be the greatest fighter and never win a UFC title. You have to wonder, what's his mindset now moving forward? Does he want to keep trying to climb the ladder? He did get up to number 4 in the rankings. He was one fight away, arguably, from the belt. Does he sit around and wait for McGregor to come back from his own hand injury and say, Cerrone versus McGregor for New Year's? The UFC loves to have these big fight cards on New Year's Eve weekend. Does he sit around and wait for that event? I'm not fully sure. And that's where Cerrone and Ferguson are both at a tough situation, because both of these are fighters who they've really been waiting around for someone to let them take a shot at the belt. And Ferguson, he had the interim belt. It was taken away from him because of injuries that were out of his control. He was supposed to fight for the belt. He didn't get the chance. Cerrone's a guy who gave Ferguson a fight. Does Tony want a rematch with him? Does Tony want to wait around for the next title holder? Does Tony want to take the next guy in the rankings to hold him over? Does Tony try to make a fight with Conor McGregor? It's a tough situation. I think ideally, the ideal situation for the UFC is Ferguson to wait for the lightweight title, get the winner of Khabib versus Poirier, and then I think ideally, Cerrone's coming off a loss, McGregor's coming off a loss. You want to see a great fight. Let's see McGregor versus Cerrone, and make that for like New Year's Eve weekend or some other big venue in like November or December. Put those guys on the card, let them fight, let Ferguson be the next in line for the title. And I think everything plays itself out from there, because everyone behind Ferguson, McGregor, and Cerrone, all of them have spotty resumes right now. Gaethje's only on a 2-fight winning streak. Cerrone just beat Al Iaquinta. Barbosa just lost to Gaethje. Nobody in the top 10 right now has a real stake at trying to make a run at the belt. The only guy who has a stake right now is Ferguson. And I think that with McGregor losing to Khabib and Cerrone losing to Ferguson, it should be McGregor versus Cerrone, and then Ferguson should get the next shot at the belt. But we'll have to wait and see if Tony Ferguson really wants to wait for however long it's going to take for him to get a shot at the belt. The third fight on the card that I want to touch on is Valentina Shevchenko's dominant performance, which ended in a brutal head kick victory over Jessica Eye. First of all, Jessica Eye deserves a lot of credit for being willing to fight Shevchenko and not being afraid. She tried to take it to her. She tried to push the pace, but Shevchenko dominated her on the ground, something I did not expect to see in this fight. Shevchenko is more so known for her stand-up game, and she showed great control in the grappling game versus Jessica Eye in the second round. Shevchenko showed why she is a dominant kickboxer with the head kick, arguably one of the most brutal head kicks we've seen in the UFC in a long time. Really reminded me personally, I remember when Vitor Belfort with the head kick, the Dan Henderson years ago, and then before that, Mikko Crow Cop when he was in Pride, with the powerful leg kicks when he was knocking out guys in Pride. That's really what I saw when I saw Shevchenko do that kick. I saw a dominant, powerful fighter. And for Valentina, the UFC's got some questions because she's in a very interesting predicament as well, in a different way. I mentioned Tony Ferguson's in a predicament because he's kind of left in a holding pattern, whereas Valentina is in an interesting predicament because She has shown herself to be one of the most dominant and arguably scary fighters in all of MMA. When you think about it, Valentina Shevchenko has lost to one woman since she entered the UFC, and that is arguably the pound-for-pound women's best fighter on the planet, Amanda Nunes. Shevchenko has lost twice to Nunes, split decision and unanimous decision. Aside from her, Valentina has beaten every single woman who has stood across from her in the UFC. And outside of Amanda Nunes, Valentina Shevchenko has not lost to anyone else since 2010. So you're talking about someone in Valentina Shevchenko who's not just a dominant UFC champion, but she is arguably an impressive and scary fighter for anyone to take on. And you look at the rankings right now, Caitlin Chookagian, she just beat Jessica Calderwood. She's arguably the next number one contender. But what is really Caitlin going to offer Valentina that she hasn't seen before? No offense to Caitlin. Look, she's a talented fighter. She's an aggressive fighter. But Caitlin, she lost to Jessica Ai in her previous fight. She just beat Joanne Calderwood by decision. Before that, she had all of her wins by decision over Alexis Davis, Mara Romero Barella, and Irene Aldana. It's not like she was dominating people by finishes or submissions. So what is really she going to offer Valentina that Valentina can't handle? And you look at the rest of the division, Joanna Jędrzejczyk, who knows what she wants to do? Does she want to stay at 125? Does she want to go back down to a lighter weight class? You know, Joanna's got a lot of decisions to make there. Calderwood just lost. Roxanne Modafferi, you know, she's getting older. Who knows how many fights she really has left and that she wants to do. And then the rest of the division is in flux. So for Valentina, she's a bit of a holding pattern because with Nunes fighting Holly Holm next, does Valentina just want to keep clearing out the division at 125? Does she maybe look to move up to 135 if Holly Holm wins? If Amanda Nunes keeps winning, then, you know, does Valentina even consider a cut to 115? Does she maybe see if Jessica Andrade can go on a winning streak and maybe have a champ versus champ fight? Does Joanna try to have another fight with Valentina? I mean, there's a lot of questions out there about, you know, what Valentina is going to do. And I remember years ago when Anderson Silva was at 185, he wasn't just a champion of the middleweight division, but he was the pound for pound best fighter in the world for a long time. And I remember when he didn't have the most interesting fights going on or the best opportunities for him to defend his belt, what did he do? He moved up to 205 for other fights, like the Forrest Griffin fight where he had that brutal knockout over the former UFC 205-pound champion. And Anderson basically kept active to keep fighting. And you kind of have to wonder, does Valentina say, look, I don't know if there's really a number one contender at 125, so maybe instead of defending my belt next, what I do is I move up to 135 and take on someone in that division just to give me a fight, just to give me something going on while I wait for my division to kind of work itself out. You know, whether she wants to see if maybe an Aspen Ladd wants to fight her or a former number one contender, Kat Zingano, wants to fight her. I think that might be the way for her to go at this point, because I think that the 125-pound division doesn't have a clear-cut next woman up for the number one contender spot. I know there's a lot of names in the division, but there's no consensus on who should be the next one up. Caitlin Chookagian, you have Liz Carmouche, Joanna Jędrzejczyk, Roxanne Modafferi. Joanne Calderwood just lost. There's no consensus next number one contender for Valentina. So maybe what the UFC can do is give her a fight to stay active, whether it's an Aspen Ladd, a Raquel Pennington, a Kat Zingano at 135, while the 125-pound division figures itself out. Liz Carmouche versus Roxanne is coming up in July, so maybe the winner of Carmouche versus Modafferi faces Caitlin, and that'll decide the next number one contender. In the meanwhile, Valentina can move up to 135. I think the problem for the women's weight classes right now is that the women who are the champions at 125 and 135 have beaten so many women already decisively, and the rest of the division doesn't have a dominant option to follow them up. If Amanda Nunes beats Holly Holm, who's next for her? Holly Holm is the obvious number one person to be the next challenge for Nunes. But if she beats Holly Holm, Amanda Nunes is the baddest woman on the planet right now. What is she going to do? Fight Valentina for a third time? I don't think that's really the most logical thing to go as an option, unless there's some scenario where Amanda can cut down the 125, which I doubt she would be able to do in a healthy manner. The 135-pound division is basically hoping that Holly Holm beats Amanda, because if she can't, then Amanda doesn't really have a real challenger at this point at 135. She'll have to go back to 145 for some more challenges, whether it's someone like Megan Anderson or someone else. And Valentina's in a similar position with 125. If a real challenger doesn't present herself at 125, she may have to go up to 135 to get a couple fights in just so she can stay active while the division kind of works itself out. You have a lot of fighters after UFC 238 who are in a major kind of figuring things out period. So Hudo needs to figure out, does he want to be the 125-pound champion, or does he want just big fights? You have a person, Tony Ferguson, has to make a decision. Does he wait around for another title shot, or does he stay busy with another fighter in the meantime? Donald Cerrone, does he push to get a rematch with Ferguson, or does he wait for McGregor to come back, and maybe that would be a huge payday for him until he is able to build another winning streak to go after another title shot? What does Valentina Shevchenko do? Does she wait around for the next fighter at 125? Does she move to 135 to stay busy, kind of like Anderson Silva used to do back in the day? And by the way, I mentioned earlier about the 135-pound division. Who is really number one contender? Is it Aljamain Sterling? Is it Peter Yan? Maybe they need to fight to figure out who the number one contender is. Also, a women's strawweight, Tatiana Suarez. Is she next in line for Jessica Andrade at 115? Does Rose Namajunas automatically get another rematch? Or do we see Rose versus Suarez? Nina Ansaroff lost, but it was a tough fight. Does Nina face Joanna Jędrzejczyk? Does Joanna tell the UFC, hey, I want a shot at Andrade to get my belt back? Or does Michelle Waterson have a real argument to say, look, I should get a number one contender fight. Let me fight Tatiana. There's a lot of questions that have to be answered at 115 as well. So for as great as UFC 238 was, and arguably every fight was intense, every fight was interesting, every fight gave you every bang for your buck that you spent to watch those fights from top to bottom. The main card, the prelims were all great fights. We almost walk away from UFC 238 with more questions than we walked in with. It'll be interesting to see what happens over the next few months with all these fighters coming off their wins and losses at UFC 238. Thanks for listening to episode 44 of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. If you have any thoughts on this edition of the podcast, you can drop in the comment section below. If you enjoy the Mutant Blitz Podcast, be sure to hit a like and subscribe so you catch each episode of the podcast where I give you my perspectives on the top news stories from the world of sports and the comic book and movie world. I'm your host, Josh Hennig, and I'll catch you next time right here on the Mutant Blitz Podcast.